So one of the things that we've been doing at Essential Skills Ontario with microdata is pulling apart some of the data to identify which particular groups or groups with certain characteristics, how are they doing in terms of PIAAC scores and skills. So as we looked at certain groups like Aboriginals, clearly there still are some real issues related to that population around skills, but maybe not as significant as some people were thinking. We can actually see that youth, those under the age of 30, are actually far more skilled than previous generations. And once again, we'll come back to that in a little bit. Clearly, the younger you are, once you're beyond school age, are actually the most skilled generation that the country has ever seen. We can actually see that Francophones fared very well as well. Immigrants, particularly first generation immigrants, did not fare particularly well. And there could have been a number of reasons around that. And it's likely because that the survey was conducted in English and or French. And it probably actually created some dissonance. However, some concern, given that in some other jurisdictions, immigrants seemed to fare better than here. But there are two groups in particular that I think we do need to be concerned about. First off, the growing phenomenon of NEETs. And NEET stands for Not Employed in Education or Training. Basically, it's anyone under the age of 29 who's doing none of those things. NEET is a term that emanated out of Japan. It was the first country to start to notice this sort of group out there who were doing nothing and basically had no intentions of doing things. Think of them as, someone liked to joke with me, your 28-year-old nephew who stays in their parents' basement playing video games all day. And yes, other countries have started to look at this particular group. They're largely male, under the age of 30, seemingly have dropped out of society. And in the United Kingdom and a few other countries, they've been studying this particular phenomenon for a while. And why is it of such a concern? Because, in fact, NEETs, when you start to look at other sets of data, are the ones who probably cause the most problems in society, either whether it is in the criminal justice system, drugs, alcoholism, depression, suicide rates, and homelessness. So you actually start to look at that data. This is where you see the real problems and should be a growing policy concern if we're concerned about the well-being of not only the province, but the nation as well. Finally, and at no time has it been so clear, because you still encounter this sometimes, that people don't equate educational attainment with skills. And whether it's the National Household Survey or it's PIAAC, let this not be in doubt. The value of education and its relationship to actual skills has never been so strong. That the correlation between those two pieces is very clear. And partly because we're dealing with other sets of data. And this is where I start to think that you start to see some things in this data which counters some of the conventional wisdoms and things we're seeing out there. So first off, also about youth unemployment, and I could pull up another chart about that, won't, is youth unemployment is basically no worse than it has been at any time. In fact, StatsCan did a piece on that in the middle of this past year. That basically youth unemployment, when done in conjunction with unemployment rates for older individuals basically parallels. The reality is that youth lag in terms of employment when they first leave school. Youth are often underemployed. They don't go to their dream job in the first 2 years. And there is some evidence that the youth unemployment rates haven't actually changed, that it's expectations around employment that have changed. Now, there is one major exception when you start to pull apart the data around youth unemployment, and that is young males with high school or less education. They have not returned to their normal rates of employment, and I think that that is likely accounted for in the great decline of manufacturing. And as I've often said to policymakers, if that actually seems to be the core root of, where we're having challenges around youth employment, we should be looking at other policy measures, right, that will actually address that particular group. And furthermore, why I sort of want to counter some of the stories about underemployed university graduates, college graduates, etc., is the relationship between educational attainment and employment rates has never been so strong. Furthermore, educational attainment and future earning trajectories have never been so strong. So I worry that there is a bit of a message getting out there that would suggest that if you go to university or college for a few years, you're going to end up just being a barista at Starbucks. And the reality, when it comes to data, couldn't be further from the truth. So one of the reasons why NAETs are sort of interesting, we're just starting in our office to pull apart that data, is if we actually look at scores over time, we see a really interesting phenomenon about our youth. And why I do want to counter some of the discussions about the value of education. So if we take a look at young adults in education, we actually see quite a high skills trajectory, right? That over time, they're actually gaining skills as they're in school. We look at youth in education and work, and they're also gaining in skills, and interestingly enough, at a slightly higher clip. The combination of work and education together seem to actually spur learning. We look at youth who don't go on to any education after school, after they leave school, and go straight into work. And we actually see that the skills trajectory is quite high as well. They are starting off from a lower point, but over years, over those first few years of school, they're gaining skills. But when we start to look at those who don't remain in school, we're learning something. So not only are they not gaining skills, they're losing them. Over time, if they're not participating in work or education, it would seem to indicate that those, as a group, will lose skills over time, which is a good reason for not having youth either unemployed or out of school for any extensive period of time at all. And as I mentioned before, if you plot scores over time, and by the way, I could have done this for literacy, I could have done it for numeracy. Numeracy is a little bit more flat, and I could have done it for problem solving in technology-rich environments, and it's the decline over time is actually even greater, but for today we'll just use literacy. And we do see that basically the younger you are, the higher your literacy level. And as it goes through time, we see the literacy levels decline. And what it doesn't necessarily mean that literacy skills decline as you get older. It just means that previous generations just didn't get as many skills. And by the way, so if we did a chart around educational attainment, in terms of post-secondary rates, we would see that that line would probably run reasonably parallel to this line as well. But certainly, it's not a case of a younger generation not having skills. They are actually quite skilled. And if we want to think about Canada sort of in an international context, I'm going to do some comparisons here. I find this actually quite interesting, and furthermore, I think it's quite important. So, as they look at literacy scores between, say, younger generation and older generations in terms of early years in the workforce, we take a look at Korea, and we can see that Korea over time has the highest increase in scores, i.e. there's a huge divide between the skills of younger Koreans and older Koreans. And that's actually quite important, so that Korea is actually developing more human capital. And I don't think it's just by chance that Korea has one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Korea put a very high value on education. We look at the OECD average in Ontario, Canada. So yeah, there is a divide. It's not as great as some countries, and it's greater than others. It was pretty close to the average. And you really do want the younger generation to have more skills than the previous generation. Clearly, it spurs economic growth. The United States, it's probably a bit of a concern. That gap should be wider. And in fact, even if you look at educational attainment rates in the US, they've stalled, right? This next generation isn't necessarily going to have more education than the previous generation, unlike most jurisdictions. Of course, to say, very few places did PIAAC get big headlines. The one place that it did was in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, it rang all sorts of alarm bells, because the current generation coming out of the UK school system were actually, in many cases, less literate than not only their parents' generation, but possibly their grandparents' generation. And this has to be a major concern for policymakers. And in the UK, they've launched a number of commissions to actually look at what was the problem, because it wasn't just in literacy, it was in numeracy as well. And clearly, there's been something that has not gone quite right when it comes to the UK's public education system, and it's going to need to be looked at. And I say, same thing with the US. You want that gap to be so much higher. I'm now coming to a few slides that I think are actually critically important for policymakers, literacy practitioners, and others, because I think some of the next slides we're going to see truly counter some things that we've been hearing. So a couple of things related to this particular piece of data. And again, I want this noted, and PIAAC really emphasized this, the relationship between PIAAC scores and educational attainment were remarkably strong. That I think at this point in time, you don't say that there's correlation, that there's actually causation, that they're so tightly wound around each other. And as we see, the levels really drop off for those who do not have high school attainment. For those who have high school, yes, they have more skills, but nowhere near as much as those who have post-secondary education. And one of the things, because it did make news, I said some of the stuff around PIAAC didn't make headlines very much. But if we actually look at post-secondary scores, and this caused some consternation in the province, that it would appear that Ontario's post-secondary graduates were not as literate as other university graduates in other jurisdictions. And there was a few little articles about that, not a real crisis, but some consternation. But actually, and it was the conference board who did this, ESO had been doing this, but related to another issue. Once you control for foreign students, or immigrants who are in university, of which Ontario has a really quite a high percentage, once you control for that, Ontario university graduates and college graduates, we don't need to worry about them. They're just as literate as any other jurisdiction. To me, the next two slides are perhaps the most important slides that I'm going to be talking about today. And unfortunately, I know they're a little bit complex. But basically, this chart demonstrates the relationship between educational attainment, training, and literacy scores. And to make a long story short, is what this chart demonstrates is that the less education you have in your past likely will lead to less education in the future. So if we look at post-secondary graduates, they're very likely to be participating in further education, upgrading their skills, whether through formal or informal means. We also see that for college graduates. But as a person becomes less skilled, we recognize that they're actually going to get the least skills. They are the least likely to participate in training. And why is this interesting? Because it partly explains the skills divide, or what I describe as this fat tails or skills bifurcation, right? And Canada was a real anomaly in terms of some of the PIAAC data around this, is that there, in many other countries, you saw more of a linear line. Whereas in Canada, the reality is, those who are the most skilled are going to get more skills, while those with the least skills are going to get the least skills. So this is basically happening in terms of what the choices people are making, but where government is actually making expenditures. As I said, I'm not sure that some of our policies, which seem to be designed around the challenge of the university graduate barista, is really where some of our skills challenges lies. And the Canada-Ontario Jobs Grant is actually quite important. In the next slide, we're going to follow that through a little bit. This chart shows the relationship between on-the-job training and a person's educational attainment level and PIAAC scores. And this chart, I think, is also quite interesting because it also tells a story. So there seems to be a story out there that Canadian employers are not training. And as we start to look at this, we go, well, hang on a second. employers actually in Canada are training, it's just who they're training. So once again, if we pulled out back the other slide, they almost parallel each other. Employers seem, the person with post-secondary attainment is reasonably likely to get additional training paid for or taken care of by their employer. But it becomes less likely to get training in terms of the lower your educational attainment. So people without a high school diploma or only a high school diploma are very unlikely to be getting trained in the workplace. And I think one has to ask themselves, since the major initiative, is the Canada-Ontario Jobs Grant, which is going towards upskill employees, which group do we think that it will go to? And I'm not certain, under its current design, I think there's lots of merits towards having employers do more training. But I think if we looked more closely in terms of public good and issues of economic mobility, that these dollars might be more wisely invested for those with high school or less. Because without dollars, they're very unlikely to get trained. Of course, our fear at ESO is most of those dollars may go to that group, the far end, the post-secondary, who are actually likely to get some training from their employer in the first place. They say this is why PIAAC is full of little stories. And this is an important one, because it relates to where, as a society, government, and policymakers try and target dollars around skills training. The realities are, yes, there are certain elements of fiscal restraint that need to be going on within government. It's very unlikely the training pool is going to get larger. But we can actually use PIAAC data to try and figure out who doesn't have skills, how do we identify them, and how do we get it into their hands. Even in Germany, they're pulling apart PIAAC data trying to figure out who are skilled individuals in our society and who are those who don't have them, and how can we use PIAAC data to target them. And I think this is really important. I'd have been tempted, since I know many people watching this will be utilizing EOIS CAMs, and also looking at the province of Ontario priorities on who our clients or participants should be. Well, I think they should be closely looking at the PIAAC data to try and figure out, are there groups, are there individuals that demonstrate through PIAAC with certain characteristics that actually say literacy and basic skills programs should be targeted. The reality is, and I think in probably a reasonably ideal world, we would want the data from the Employment Ontario Information System, as it relates to literacy and basic skills, kind of to parallel the PIAAC data, right? So something like educational attainment. We should be able to say, okay, we should see similar groups, similar characteristics in the program. And of course, we don't know that that isn't happening. We also don't know that it is. And someone needs to be taking a good, close look at that. And as I say, neither at a federal or provincial level am I hearing any rumblings about this data being used in any way to inform policy. Another important point that is emerging and coming out of PIAAC is the importance of generations and parents' literacy skills. And by the way, for this chart, I could have chosen mother or father's level of educational attainment, and the results are actually the same. But what we see is that a child's or future adult's skill level has a very strong correlation to their parents' skill level or level of educational attainment. And this is really important to change the tide around them. So if we're to break the issues of poverty and other challenges as it relates to social justice, if we're actually to break social assistance cycles, secular welfare dependency, this is something that needs to change. That it should be regardless of a parent's educational attainment. Their children's or young adult scores should flat be the same regardless of who your parents were. And unfortunately, at this juncture, we're not seeing. And it's something that we have to think about, because clearly a parent's literacy, the more literate a parent you have, the more literate you will be, and the more literate your children will be. I'd like to thank everyone for spending some time with me today. And I would like to finish off, though, with a number of key points. For today, this is a static list, but we're adding points onto our list of important points all the time. As I say, we're data mining at the moment through the PIAAC microdata. And I think one of the great things is that we as an organization, ESO, and others, have far greater access to the data than previous surveys. It was actually very difficult to get microdata from previous surveys. And so groups like ESO, it allows for a more independent analysis of the actual data itself. It takes time, but it is important that others look over data aside from just the government itself. So some of the things that really bear repeating. First off, years of educational attainment really matter, right? In short, have your kids stay in school. Canada and Ontario, as I say, there's no major stories about how we're faring against others, except in one particular item. Our bifurcation of skills, I call them fat tails. That Ontario has an awful lot of people at the high end of the skills spectrum, more than other places, but we also have many at the lower end of the spectrum, higher than other places. Clearly, we don't want that kind of skills divide. And that clearly tells us that we need to engage lower skilled Ontarians in education and training, right? Those who don't have skills. We need to do better about getting them into our programs or designing interventions to raise their skills. It's probably quite critical. And we need to look at that PIAAC data more closely to say to ourselves, are those without skills coming to our programs? And if not, why not? We need to further investigate the PIAAC data. And one of the reasons why is so that the same mistakes that have happened with IELTS and ALS don't occur this time around. And so far, so good. As I say, I think at ESO, we don't want to see anything that says 1 out of blank is functionally illiterate. One just can't make those judgments. There is no clear delineation between what is literate enough and not. Things are just far too complex. Furthermore, and we didn't talk much about this today, but I'll be talking more about this in the future. And that is these two terms. Correlation, which is the relationship between two data sets, and causation, which means something causes a particular problem. And correlation is not causation. So for example, one of the interesting things that came out of the last survey, and has been often repeated, was that if we improved our adult literacy levels, our healthcare costs would plummet. Why? Because those at lower skill levels there's a correlation between skill level and health. But I don't think that we know that anything about that if you actually raise someone's literacy level, whether their health actually would miraculously become better, or whether it's just a relationship. So we have to be very cautious until we explore things further before making, I think, relatively outlandish statements. You know, I didn't hear anyone in the healthcare system saying, well, if you improve people's health, if you inject another $3.8 billion into the health system, we'll raise literacy levels by 27 points. No one in the healthcare movement was talking about that, so I'm a little surprised we ended those. Like, I'm not sure if we gave everyone in Ontario pre and post, say, Tao's assessment, and we raised everyone's scores by 25 points, I'm not sure we're going to see a decline of $3.8 billion in terms of healthcare expenditures. Correlation is not causation. We need to always explore those things. And my final point, and it's something that will be coming from Essential Skills Ontario a lot over the coming year, is we need a skills strategy, right? Everybody now says evidence-based decision-making. Evidence-based decision-making. When frankly, more often, I see decision-based evidence. We need to be pulling PIAAC apart and utilizing it in terms of evaluating our training system, examining who needs skills, and starting to look at who's getting served in Employment Ontario, who's not getting served, and why. These are absolutely the most critical questions, and PIAAC should be utilized for that purpose. We should be able to examine data sets and be able to draw some conclusions. We think it's really important that Ontario creates a long-term strategy for getting skills into the hands of those families and vulnerable individuals who need them the most, and to create economic mobility for the working poor. Ontario doesn't fare so well in PIAAC, and I hope that the story is not the same 9 to 10 years from now when the next survey comes in. That some of those fat tails will have declined, and that we'll see a stronger relationship between public and private expenditures on training, that the gap won't be so big. Last slide. So in summation, I'd like to thank my friends at DLI for hosting this session. I've greatly enjoyed it. And also, let's treat this like the start of a conversation. If you have any questions whatsoever about PIAAC or other sets of data, don't hesitate to contact me. And my contact information is on the following slide. So please just let me know if you have some questions, and we'll get back to you. Again, thank you very much.